In a time of war, collapse, and confusion, one man chose not to fight with blades, but with virtue. His name was Confucius, and though he died centuries ago, his voice still whispers through the laws, customs, and cultures of modern China and far beyond. In this powerful journey, we're not just exploring the life of a philosopher, we're unraveling the mind that gave civilization a moral backbone. If this kind of deep storytelling moves you, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more epic history brought to life, and comment below, is wisdom still the answer in today's chaotic world? Share this with someone who still believes that words can be stronger than war. If you're someone who feels a chill down your spine when history whispers its forgotten tales, if you find beauty in broken crowns, lost empires, and powerful souls who changed the world, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Dark Historian Tales, the channel where we bring the shadows of the past into the light through emotional storytelling, raw truths, and dramatic journeys that shaped humanity. This isn't just history, it's the heartbeat of those who lived, loved, lost, and left a legacy. Backhanded Expointing writes, so if you love powerful historical stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. Because here, history doesn't just speak, it haunts. In the ancient valleys of eastern China, where rivers whispered through bamboo groves and the air carried the scent of mulberry and dust, a child was born into the bones of a broken world. The year was 551 BC. The Zhou dynasty, once radiant in its authority, had decayed into symbolism, a crown without a head, a palace without a pulse. The emperor still sat on a throne in name, but real power had scattered like dried leaves in the wind, claimed by feudal lords and war chiefs who ruled their territories with blades, not laws. It was the spring and autumn period, a time named with poetic irony. There was little spring in the hearts of men, and even less autumn to mourn the fading of order. China had fractured into countless fiefdoms, and in this dust of dignity, war had become the language of diplomacy, and survival the only virtue. Amidst this quiet ruin, in the small and struggling state of Lu, a child named Kong Qiu was born. His family belonged to the lower branch of nobility, once respected but now forgotten, like the ruins of an ancestral temple crumbling in the shadow of a new regime. His father, Kong He, had once been a military commander, praised for his strength, feared for his discipline, and known for a cold kind of honor that made him more iron than man. But by the time Kong Qiu was born, his father was old, nearly 70, and had already buried one wife. From her, he had sired daughters and a son, but none who could carry on the family line with strength. Desperate for an heir, he took a much younger woman, Yan Jingzai, from humble origins. She gave him what he craved, a son. But fate is rarely generous for long. When Kong Qiu was just 3 years old, his father died, leaving his mother widowed, and his household drifting into obscurity. The death of Kong he should have left behind an inheritance, a title, or protection. Instead, it left only shadows. His lineage was questioned by elites. His rights were dismissed. The world saw him not as a boy of noble blood, but as an unwanted child clinging to a name that no longer mattered. His mother, young and alone, raised him in poverty, teaching him resilience not through sermons, but through her quiet refusal to collapse. They lived simply, humbly, perhaps even shamefully by aristocratic standards. Confucius, even as a child, was keenly aware of his family's disgrace. He heard the whispers. He noticed how people looked away. But instead of surrendering to bitterness, something deeper stirred within him. An ache, not just to restore his family's name, but to understand why the world had lost its balance. Why men killed instead of reasoned. Why loyalty meant little and ritual even less. He did not want to be a warlord. He wanted to fix what was broken, not just around him, but within people. He was not born with power. He was born with questions. His mother became his first teacher. She taught him to read and write, to revere ancestors, to respect the dead, and to listen before speaking. When he asked why people no longer honored the old ways, she simply said, "Because they've forgotten what they mean." That sentence stayed with him like an arrow lodged in his chest. What use was ritual if people no longer believed in the spirit behind it? What use was hierarchy if it brought no justice? In the absence of privilege, young Kong Chiu made learning his refuge. He read what few scrolls he could access. He listened to traveling scholars, memorized ancient poetry, and observed the ceremonies of state with the intensity of a priest. He wasn't just curious, he was hungry. Hungry for wisdom, for meaning, for a map back to order. Unlike the sons of lords who were taught arrogance, he taught himself humility. While others practiced swordplay, he practiced silence. And yet, even in silence, he was not passive. From an early age, he began questioning authority, not with rebellion, but with reason. He saw in the chaos of his time a pattern, that the world had lost not power, but principle. The rulers no longer ruled by virtue, but by fear. Rituals were performed without sincerity. Words were spoken without truth. And the people, ordinary and desperate, had no compass to follow. The mandate of heaven, once believed to be the divine endorsement of a just ruler, had become a myth. In its place, men worshipped ambition. And Confucius, still a boy, began to understand something terrifying. A society without virtue eats itself alive. By the time he was in his teens, he was already working. He held minor jobs, clerkships, warehouse positions, menial state labor, not because he was eager for coin, but because he wanted to observe. He watched how officials treated the poor. He watched how justice was twisted for favor. He watched how men bowed in court yet schemed in private. Every moment became a lesson. Every cruelty a question. And still, he studied. His brilliance was not in innovation, but in remembrance. He looked backward, not forward, believing that the ancient sages, the kings of old, had once known the right path. Somewhere in their forgotten words and dusty scrolls was a blueprint for virtue. He developed a theory, not of governance, but of harmony. That society could only function when each part played its proper role. The father must be honorable. The son must be respectful. The ruler must be just. The subject must be loyal. But these were not blind obligations. They were earned, symbiotic, alive. A king who ruled without virtue was no king. A child who rebelled without cause was no victim. It was a delicate dance, and when one part broke, the entire song fell into noise. He was not yet a teacher. He had no school, no disciples, just thoughts, questions, and one broken country screaming for an answer. When he reached his early 20s, Confucius married. He had a son. For a time, he lived quietly, but the hunger did not leave him. It only sharpened. He began to speak, carefully at first, to local officials and fellow thinkers. His ideas, rooted in the past, sounded revolutionary to a world that had abandoned tradition. Some mocked him. Some dismissed him as a dreamer. But others, especially the young, leaned in. They heard not nostalgia in his voice, but clarity. In a time of moral fog, Confucius was beginning to speak like a man who saw the road clearly. Still, the world did not yet recognize him. He remained a minor figure, respected but not revered. His teachings had not yet formed into doctrine. His analects had not yet been recorded. But something had begun, a whisper, a ripple, a quiet shift. He had been born into silence, into poverty, into a forgotten name. But he had taken that silence and from it, drawn a question so powerful that the world, centuries later, would still tremble beneath its weight. What makes a society good? Not rich, not feared, not powerful, but good. And that was only the beginning. By the time he entered his 30s, he had lived through enough injustice, humiliation, and broken promises to know that the world would not fix itself. He had seen good men go unheard, bad men rewarded, and rituals turned into hollow performances. And so, slowly but surely, he began to speak. At first, it was quiet, conversations with local officials, discussions in market courtyards, and long dialogues with curious minds. He wasn't preaching. He was teaching, asking questions, drawing wisdom out of silence. He didn't speak like a man who wanted power. He spoke like a man who wanted balance. He called it ren humanus. Not a law, not a policy, but a virtue that lived in the heart. To Confucius, the world did not need more soldiers or more punishments. It needed better people. It needed fathers who were kind, sons who were loyal, rulers who led by moral example, not fear. Harmony, he believed, did not begin with armies. It began at the dinner table. He began gathering students, not wealthy nobles, but young men hungry for meaning. Many of them were poor, like he had once been. Some were sons of merchants, others of minor bureaucrats. To them, Confucius was more than a teacher. He was a guide through a dark forest. He listened more than he lectured, and when he spoke, it felt like truth remembered. They sat in the shade of trees, inside modest halls, or beside rivers and walked for miles discussing justice, loyalty, and the art of ruling. He taught them that a man must first master himself before he can guide others. That sincerity was worth more than wealth. That to know virtue and not act on it was the greatest failure of all. To Confucius, ritual, what he called Li, was not superstition. It was the soul of society. Bowing to elders, honoring ancestors, speaking with respect, these were not empty gestures. They were reminders that every person was part of something greater. A family, a nation, a history. Ritual was the choreography of peace. Lose it and people became wild. But perhaps the most radical idea he taught was this: rulers must earn their obedience. Power, to him, was not a right, it was a responsibility. A king who abused his people had no moral claim to the throne. He called it the mandate of heaven, and he taught that heaven could abandon rulers who failed their moral duty. It was a dangerous idea. One that questioned tyranny not with rebellion, but with righteousness. And yet, despite the beauty of his words, Confucius found little favor in the courts. The rulers of the time did not want harmony. They wanted dominance. They wanted tactics, not ethics. Advisors who would flatter, not challenge. And Confucius was never a flatterer. He would rather lose his position than lie. So while he was occasionally appointed to small government roles, like managing granaries or overseeing rituals, he was never fully embraced by the elite. But he didn't stop. Instead of chasing favor, he chased truth. His students wrote down his words. They called him Master Calm. And slowly, what began as a voice became a philosophy. He taught that 5 relationships formed the foundation of all society. 1. Ruler and subject. 2. Father and son. 3. Husband and wife. 4. Elder brother and younger brother. 5. Friend and friend. Each relationship carried duties, responsibilities, boundaries, but above all, they required virtue. Without it, titles meant nothing. He urged his students to study the past, to learn from the sages, to recite poetry, to think deeply. He believed that a cultivated mind created a cultivated soul, and a nation filled with cultivated souls, that, to him, was peace. His words began to echo beyond Lu. Travelers spoke of him. Young men from other states sought him out. His reputation grew, not as a prophet or politician, but as a moral anchor in a time of drifting. But still, the rulers didn't listen. They feared his ideals because they demanded too much from those in power. And so, in his 40s, Confucius faced a new challenge. Would he remain in Lu, a teacher with no platform? Or would he carry his message beyond the borders of home? He chose to walk. What followed would become the most uncertain, painful, yet defining period of his life. A journey through rejection, exile, and danger. But before that journey began, something had changed. The quiet boy born into silence had found his voice. And that voice, soft but unwavering, would become the moral compass of a civilization. The decision did not come easily. Confucius was already in his early 50s, an age when most men of the time retreated into comfort or became counselors under a protective lord. But comfort had never been his goal. If rulers would not come to virtue, then virtue would go to rulers. And so, with little more than scrolls, sandals, and the fire of conviction, Confucius left Lu. He took with him a handful of loyal disciples, men who called him master, but who also walked beside him as equals in hardship. Thus began one of the most extraordinary and painful chapters of his life, a decade-long journey through hostile states, rejection, humiliation, and near starvation. It would be the crucible in which his teachings were tested, not in theory, but in the grit of the real world. The journey was brutal. Roads were treacherous. Bandits roamed freely. Many regions were at war or on the edge of it. City gates were locked. Officials were suspicious. To be a wandering philosopher in such times was to invite danger, and Confucius often found himself turned away before he could even speak. But he did not lose hope. At every city gate, he bowed with respect. At every refusal, he thanked them for their time. His dignity, even in rejection, was unwavering. That alone made him unforgettable. In the state of Wei, he met with Duke Ling, a ruler known more for luxury than leadership. The Duke listened politely, but quickly grew disinterested. Confucius had no flattery in him. He spoke of moral governance, of placing the virtuous in power, of using ritual to restore harmony. The court, filled with opportunists and flatterers, mocked him. One advisor laughed and asked, "Do you think the world runs on courtesy and poems, old man?" Confucius only smiled and replied, better poems than blood. In another state, he was accused of spying and nearly executed. In the state of song, he was warned not to teach lest he corrupt the minds of the youth with dangerous ideas. And in China, he and his followers went days without food, surrounded by soldiers who sought to starve them into silence. One disciple, Zilu, raged against their treatment, asking why heaven allowed such injustice. Confucius, weak with hunger but calm, answered, "Heaven gave me life, not comfort." Despite the humiliations, something remarkable began to happen. Even as rulers rejected him, people began to notice. Farmers, merchants, wandering scribes, they stopped to listen. They heard not just philosophy, but decency. In a world ruled by fear, here was a man who spoke gently, who bowed even to beggars, who treated servants as brothers. His life was his teaching. His disciples grew stronger, not in number, but in depth. They debated with him, challenged him, wept with him. He never pretended to be perfect. He admitted when he was wrong. When one student asked why the world didn't change, Confucius said, "Because we haven't changed ourselves." He gathered knowledge everywhere he went. Every city he visited, every court he entered, even those that rejected him, became part of his mental scroll. He remembered names, customs, punishments, rituals. His mind was a library, and from it, he carved a vision, not just of China, but of humanity as it could be. He spoke constantly of humaneness, not charity, but empathy. The ability to feel what another feels, to act with conscience. He spoke of ritual, not as superstition, but as structure. A moral language that reminded people who they were. And he spoke of righteousness. Doing what is right, even when it is not rewarded. Especially then. His travels led him to Qi, one of the most powerful states of the time. Its ruler, Duke Jing, listened intently to Confucius and even seemed moved by his teachings. For a moment, it seemed he might find a place at court. But politics intervened. Powerful ministers, threatened by Confucius's influence, whispered poison into the Duke's ear. He was sent away again. The court chose ease over truth. Years passed. Confucius grew older. His hair grayed, his walk slowed. But his spirit never dimmed. Wherever he was allowed to stay, he taught. When they silenced him, he taught in whispers. When they drove him out, he taught on the road. He once said, "To teach others while not being employed by the state, is this not the greatest freedom?" By the time he returned to Lu in his late 60s, he had become more than a man. He was a movement. The very world that had denied him had begun to adopt his ideas quietly, often without credit, but undeniably. Young officials quoted him in debates. His disciples became advisors to kings. And though he never held high office, he had influenced more policy than many who did. Confucius would later say, "I am not a creator. I am a transmitter." He did not claim to invent wisdom, only to remind the world of what it had forgotten. He had wandered for over a decade, slept under stars, faced death, endured ridicule, and yet he returned with nothing but gratitude. Because through exile, he had proven his philosophy not just in words, but in life. The sage had been tested, and the sage had endured. By the time Confucius returned to Lu, the world had changed, but not in the way he had hoped. The chaos still clung to the land like a sickness. Warlords still postured, Rituals still echoed hollow through the halls of palaces, and power still rested in the hands of those who least deserved it. But something else had changed, something quieter, deeper. Confucius was no longer just a wandering thinker. He had become a living symbol. Word of his teachings had spread far beyond the cities he had visited. His wisdom, once whispered between disciples in exile, had trickled into the hearts of young scholars, thoughtful ministers, and even the homes of peasants. He returned not as a forgotten old man, but as a respected master. But his return wasn't triumphant. There were no banners, no titles, no royal summons. Instead, there was a small home, a scroll-filled room, a bamboo mat to sit on, and around him, students. They came from all walks of life. Sons of farmers, sons of merchants, even a few sons of minor nobility, drawn not by blood but by the magnetism of virtue. They didn't come for power. They came to understand,
to grow,
to question, to be better. Confucius taught them not just how to speak or debate, but how to live. In every lesson, there was a moral. In every conversation, a reflection. He told them, "A gentleman is modest in speech, but exceeds in action." He reminded them, "Learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous." He challenged them. If you govern by punishment, the people may avoid wrongdoing, but they will have no shame. If you govern by virtue, they will reform themselves. His classroom was everywhere, beneath trees, in courtyards, by rivers, during meals. There were no degrees, no ranks, no exams. Only character. His disciples weren't memorizing texts for prestige. They were shaping themselves into men who could carry the weight of a crumbling world on their backs with dignity. Each student had a different nature. Some were fiery and bold, like Zilu, who spoke his mind and longed for action. Some were reflective and gentle, like Yan Hui, Confucius's most beloved disciple, known for his calm wisdom and simple heart. Others, like Zigong, were intelligent and eloquent, skilled in diplomacy. Confucius never tried to make them the same. He saw their differences as strengths. He guided each one according to their path. But not every moment was peace. There were arguments,
tears, doubts.
Some students questioned his methods. Others feared his philosophy had no place in a world so dark. Confucius welcomed all of it. He once told them, "Do not worry that others do not understand you. Worry that you do not understand them." He never claimed to know everything. In fact, he often said, "I transmit, but do not invent. I trust in the ancients and love their words." He told them stories of past kings, Yao, Shan Yu, legendary sages who ruled with humility, virtue, and wisdom. He made history come alive not as myth, but as model. To him, the ancients were not idols. They were blueprints for what could still be. But the most sacred of all was the Analects, not as a book yet, but as conversations. Dialogues recorded, scribbled, shared between disciples. These words would later be written down as the heart of Confucian thought. They were not sermons. They were moments, fragments of life. A question asked during a walk, a principle explained over a meal, a gentle correction after a mistake. Through these moments, Confucius wasn't building a religion. He was shaping a moral lineage. He believed that virtue is contagious, that a single good man could inspire a village could inspire a state, and a state could lift an entire nation. He believed the answer to tyranny was not revolution, but reformation of the heart. And slowly, the world began to listen. His disciples began receiving appointments. One became a magistrate, another an advisor. They didn't rise by charm or birthright, but by integrity. They carry his teachings into the palaces that once rejected him. They became the quiet architects of a new political morality. But even as his circle grew, Confucius experienced loss. Yan Hui, the disciple closest to his heart, died young. Confucius mourned deeply. He did not teach that men must be emotionless. He believed sorrow was sacred. He said, "Alas, heaven has torn me from my heart." He grieved not just for the man, but for what he represented, a future that might have been. And yet he continued. Even in grief, he taught. Even in disappointment, he hoped. He never saw himself as a sage, only a seeker. In his later years, his disciples grew in number. Some stayed. Some left to serve. Some would go on to spread his teachings far and wide. He once said, "When the year is cold, only then do we see the pine and the cypress endure." Confucius was the pine, his teachings the cypress. Through war, loss, exile, and age he endured, not with armies, but with words, not with crowns, but with character. And in the circle of young men sitting at his feet, asking questions with hungry hearts, a revolution was forming. Quiet, humble, slow, but unstoppable. He was not just teaching them how to think. He was teaching them how to lead without hatred, how to rule without pride, how to live with honor. Confucius had grown old, but not weary. His eyes, once bright with youth, were now etched with the lines of sorrow, understanding, and relentless hope. His voice had softened, but his words carried deeper weight than ever before. The decades of wandering, teaching, debating, losing, and loving had transformed him into a figure larger than a mere scholar. He was a walking testament to perseverance. And yet, in his final years, the world around him remained stubbornly unchanged. The same chaos still lingered in the courts. The same hunger for power still devoured reason. Confucius, though revered by his disciples and respected by many, had never truly seen his vision take root in the soil of the state. But he never let that extinguish his purpose. He continued to teach until the very end. Even as his body ached and his steps grew slower, students came from far and wide to learn from the master. They brought him questions about justice, politics, family, music, and even death. And to every question, Confucius offered not just answers, but reflections. When you know a thing, to hold that you know it, and when you do not know a thing, to allow that you do not know it. This is knowledge, he said, resting under the shade of an old pine, the air filled with the scent of ink and earth. He became even more introspective, often meditating on his past and the arc of his journey. He would share personal moments, not out of pride, but as cautionary tales. At 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I understood the decrees of heaven. At 60, my ear was obedient. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing what was right. He knew he was approaching the final chapters of his life, but he refused to let them be written in silence. He spoke of heaven not as a place, but as a force, an invisible order that guided the moral compass of the world. He believed deeply in its presence, though he admitted its ways were mysterious. Heaven does not speak, yet the 4 seasons run their course, and the 100 things are born. Heaven does not speak, yet it governs all. His disciples noticed the change. He had become both lighter and heavier. He smiled more, but the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. He no longer sought to reform the world through courtly appointments or royal favor. He had placed his faith entirely in the next generation, in the students who sat at his feet, scribbling his words into bamboo slips, preserving a vision that would one day ignite. But the final blows were yet to come. One by one, his closest disciples began to pass away. First was Zilu, the brave, outspoken student who had walked with him through exile and danger, killed in battle while serving a lord who would not listen. When Confucius heard the news, he was silent for a long time. Then he whispered, "Alas, the backbone of my carriage has broken." Then came Yan Hui, the student he loved most. Gentle, thoughtful, the quiet light of his circle. Yan Hui died young, and with him went a piece of Confucius's soul. He wept openly. "Heaven has abandoned me," he said. "What use is there in living without him?" He did not hide his grief. He taught his students that mourning was not weakness, that love, even when painful, was part of virtue. We are not stones. We are men. As his circle shrank, his thoughts turned more and more to legacy. He worried not about fame, but about meaning. Would his teachings survive? Would they be twisted by time? Would they be buried by war, or used by tyrants to control instead of uplift? To safeguard his thoughts, his students began compiling the Analects, a collection of his sayings, conversations, and daily wisdom. It was not meant to be scripture. It was meant to be remembrance, a mirror of the man preserved in words. And still, in his final seasons, he taught. He welcomed strangers, debated philosophers, advised minor officials who came seeking counsel. He taught that a ruler must first rule himself, that a father must first earn respect, that knowledge was nothing without ethics, and power was nothing without humility. He reminded his disciples that to serve the state without compromising one's virtue was the greatest challenge of all. As his health declined, he walked less but wrote more. He began compiling and editing ancient texts, poetry, rituals, music. He believed in continuity, in anchoring the present to the wisdom of the past. One spring morning, weakened by illness, he sat beneath the flowering branches of a plum tree. A student asked him, "Master, do you fear death?" Confucius looked at the blossoms above, their petals drifting softly to the earth. "No," he said. "To fear death is to assume life was ours to begin with. I have served heaven. I have taught men to be better. I have spoken my truth. What more can be asked?" And yet, even with this peace, there remained a quiet ache, a sorrow not for himself, but for the world. He had not seen his ideals become law. He had not seen rulers lead by run. He had not seen a nation governed by virtue alone. But he had seen something else. He had seen hearts change. He had seen young men rise with clarity, with courage. He had seen that even in the darkest age, the seed of goodness could still grow. And so, with that small hope, he prepared to leave. Confucius died in 479 BCE, surrounded by his remaining disciples. No royal tomb was built for him. No empire mourned. No trumpets rang. But a light had been lit, and that light would never go out. In the years that followed, his disciples spread his teachings across China. Kings would eventually build statues in his honor. Dynasties would call him the greatest sage. Entire systems of government would be shaped by his vision. But in truth, he died as he lived, a humble man with a weary heart and a boundless belief in what humanity could still become. He wore no crown, but he died a king of conscience, a king of questions, a king who chose virtue, even when the world chose otherwise. And in that quiet death was the beginning of a revolution that would last for millennia, not in fire, but in thought, not in conquest, but in character. When Confucius passed away in 479 BC, the world remained largely indifferent. There was no empire-wide mourning, no proclamations of loss from kings or ministers. His funeral was modest, attended by his faithful disciples and a few local admirers. To the rulers of the fractured Chinese states, his passing marked no shift in power, no loss of political weight. He was, after all, a teacher, respected perhaps, but dismissed by many as a man of ideals, not action. But what they failed to see was this. They had not buried a philosopher. They had planted a seed. In the soil of that quiet burial, in the hearts of the disciples he left behind, the teachings of Confucius began to rise. Slowly, invisibly, irresistibly. The men who had once sat beside him under trees and listened to his reflections on virtue and order now became the first messengers of a silent revolution. They traveled across kingdoms, offering their services to rulers, bringing not swords, but scrolls. They spoke not of conquest, but of humaneness, not of punishment, but of ritual and moral structure. These men were not missionaries. They were architects, trying to rebuild a broken society with tools of character, education, and ethics. One of Confucius's most prominent students, Zigong, became a respected diplomat, renowned for his ability to mediate between hostile states. Another, Zixia, helped to found academies where the Analects, the recorded sayings of their teacher, became the foundation of moral instruction. Over time, the Analects would be copied by hand, passed from scholar to scholar, preserved in bamboo, ink, and memory. Through it all, the voice of Confucius endured. For decades after his death, the growth was subtle. Confucianism was not yet an official doctrine. It had no temples, no royal endorsement, but it had truth. And in a world hungry for stability, that truth began to resonate. During the Warring States period, China descended even further into bloodshed. Kingdoms rose and fell like tides. Assassins, spies, and mercenaries ruled the political game. Philosophy became a weapon of survival. Amid this chaos, legalism, a school of thought that emphasized strict laws and harsh punishments, began to dominate. The idea was simple: man is selfish and wicked. Only force can create order. For a time, legalism ruled, especially under the Qin dynasty, whose emperor, Qin Shi Huang, unified China into 21 BC through sheer brutality. He ordered the burning of books, the burying of scholars alive, and the eradication of ideas that contradicted his rule, including Confucianism. The philosophy of Confucius, once barely alive, was nearly extinguished. But ideas, unlike empires, do not die so easily. Just 15 years after Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. The people, weary of fear, longed not for discipline, but for meaning. And it was in that longing that Confucius's words found their second life. The Han Dynasty, founded by Liu Bang, Emperor Gaozu, marked the turning point. Though Gaozu was initially indifferent to philosophy, the thinkers in his court began to debate which path China should follow. And as the memory of legalist terror still lingered, a new consensus emerged. Confucius's teachings offered not just morality, but stability. The true transformation came under Emperor Wu of Han, r. 141 to 87 BC. He made Confucianism the official ideology of the state. He established imperial academies where young men, hoping to enter government service, were trained in the classics, chief among them, the Analects and the 5 classics Confucius had edited or endorsed. To become a scholar official, one had to understand not just governance, but virtue. This marked the beginning of the Confucian civil service examination system, a practice that would shape Chinese society for over 2,000 years. Suddenly, Confucius was no longer just a teacher. He was the moral father of the state. Statues were erected in his honor. His descendants were given noble titles. Temples were built in every major city, where officials and scholars offered sacrifices to the sage. His birthday became a national holiday. Children were taught to revere him as the model human being, not a god, but a man who had reached moral perfection. Confucianism was now more than a philosophy. It was a civil religion, a social code, an educational system, a political foundation. It dictated how people bowed to their elders, how rulers spoke to their ministers, how citizens obeyed the law. For centuries, Confucian ideals shaped the Chinese family structure. The concept of filial piety, honoring one's parents and ancestors, became a pillar of social life. Ancestor worship was infused with Confucian meaning. Harmony in the family was seen as the microcosm of harmony in the state. But as Confucianism gained political dominance, it began to evolve and sometimes distort. Later dynasties used Confucian rhetoric to enforce authoritarian control. Women, in particular, suffered under rigid interpretations of Confucian hierarchy. While Confucius himself had rarely spoken of gender roles in depth, later scholars molded his teachings into tools that justified strict patriarchy. His original message of moral self-cultivation was sometimes lost in ritualism and dogma. And yet, even within these distortions, the heart of his philosophy pulsed on. The Tang dynasty saw a resurgence in Confucian scholarship, and during the Song dynasty, thinkers like Zhu Xi developed Neo-Confucianism, a more metaphysical and spiritual interpretation of the original texts. It emphasized moral intuition, inner reflection, and the unity of principle, Li, and material force, Qi. Confucius was now not just a moralist, but a sage of cosmic truth. Through invasions, collapses, and foreign rule, including the Mongols of the Yuan and the Manchus of the Qing, Confucianism adapted and endured. It was sometimes weakened, sometimes manipulated, but never erased. Even during the 20th century, when Mao Zedong and the Communist Party launched the Cultural Revolution, targeting Confucius as a symbol of feudal oppression, his spirit survived. Statues were torn down. Schools were shuttered. But in private homes, elders still quoted him. Parents still taught his maxims to children. And by the dawn of the 21st century, Confucius had risen once more. This time, not just as a Chinese figure, but as a global symbol of wisdom. Confucius institutes were established across the world, teaching Chinese language and culture. His teachings appeared in leadership seminars, ethical debates, and philosophy curricula. His name was quoted by presidents, diplomats, authors, and activists. Because Confucius did not teach a religion. He taught a way of being. He taught that knowledge without morality is dangerous. That leadership without humility is hollow. That ritual without sincerity is noise. That change begins not with revolutions, but with reflection. He taught that to be good is not always to be rewarded, but it is always right. And in that, he became immortal. From a poor boy born in a crumbling kingdom, to a teacher dismissed by kings, to a wandering sage who died without power, Confucius rose. He rose through words, through patience, through lives touched one at a time. And long after his body returned to dust, his ideas walked into palaces, classrooms, hearts. He did not conquer China. He became its soul. More than 2 millennia have passed since Confucius walked the earth, yet his words continue to echo, not merely in China, but across the globe. He is no longer confined to bamboo scrolls or dusty temples. He lives in laws, in family values, in classrooms, in conversations about ethics and leadership. His presence is subtle, but profound. He is not a god. He is not a king. He is something rare. He is a teacher whose classroom never closed. The legacy of Confucius is not simply historical. It is living, breathing, growing. In China, even after dynasties fell and political systems changed, his thought remained a compass. Emperors had invoked his teachings to govern wisely. Revolutionaries had rejected him in the name of progress. Yet, no ideology could fully erase him. Because Confucius did not bind himself to power, he bound himself to human nature. The endurance of his influence lies in the universality of his message. At its heart, Confucianism is not a religion. It is a philosophy of life. It speaks of relationships, of duty, of moral self-cultivation. It teaches that society cannot be healed with laws alone. It must begin with the heart. And in every age, no matter how advanced or cynical, this truth remains. Even outside China, the teachings of Confucius found a home. In Korea, they shaped civil service and family traditions for over 1,000 years. In Japan, during the Edo period, Confucianism was adopted by the Tokugawa shogunate to establish order and hierarchy. In Vietnam, it formed the backbone of scholarly education and bureaucratic structure. His 5 relationships, ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, elder and younger, friend and friend, became cultural DNA. But it was not just governments that found value in Confucian thought. Ordinary people did, too. A farmer seeking to raise virtuous children. A merchant striving to be honest in trade. A teacher guiding students toward moral clarity. A son learning how to honor his aging parents. Confucius gave them tools, not commandments, but principles. What makes Confucius eternal is not just what he taught, but how he taught. He never claimed divinity. He never asked for worship. He spoke as a man among men, a questioner, a thinker, a seeker of harmony. This humility gave his words a unique power. Because when a man says, "I know everything," we question him. But when a man says, "I seek to understand," we follow him. His students loved him not just for his wisdom, but for his compassion. He remembered their names, their temperaments, their hopes. He guided them as a father would, correcting them without shaming, praising them without flattering. To him, teaching was not a job, it was a moral duty. As centuries passed, philosophers across the world began to draw parallels between Confucius and their own sages. In the West, thinkers like Socrates, Aristotle, and Marcus Aurelius echoed similar themes: virtue, duty, self-discipline, and civic responsibility. Yet Confucius stood apart in one profound way. He grounded ethics in the family. To him, the family was not just a social unit. It was the training ground of virtue. If a child learned to respect their parents, they would respect authority. If a parent loved their child rightly, they would learn how to govern justly. From these small roots, a stable society could grow. Modern psychologists would later affirm this view, pointing out that early relational models shape adult behavior. In today's world, as globalization accelerates and traditions are questioned, Confucius remains surprisingly relevant. Businesses study his leadership principles. Politicians quote his wisdom in speeches. Educators apply his teachings on self-discipline and reflection. Even in the digital age, Confucius's focus on inner cultivation speaks to the emptiness felt by many. He believed that a noble person, or junzi, is not defined by birth, but by behavior. This idea challenged the rigid hierarchies of his time and continues to challenge ours. In an age obsessed with fame, money, and social status, Confucius reminds us that character, not clout, is the true measure of a person. He said, "The man of virtue thinks of the way, the small man thinks of profit." He said, "To see what is right and not do it is one of courage." He said, "When we see men of worth, we should think of equaling them. When we see men of a contrary character, we should turn inward and examine ourselves." These teachings ask us not to judge others first, but to look inward, to reflect,
to grow.
In modern China, Confucius has experienced a renaissance. After decades of marginalization, he is once again taught in schools, honored in ceremonies, and referenced in political dialogue. The government funds Confucius institutes across the globe, symbols of cultural diplomacy, but also of the enduring value of his thought. Of course, debates continue. Some argue that Confucianism has been used to suppress dissent. Others say it places too much emphasis on hierarchy. But even his critics agree. His thought is too vast, too nuanced, too deep to be confined to any single agenda. In a world shaken by technological disruption, political polarization, and moral confusion, the gentle voice of Confucius offers an antidote, not by shouting, but by reminding us of what we already know deep down. That honesty matters. That kindness matters. That listening, learning, and respecting others, even when we disagree, matters. He asks us to imagine a society where rulers are humble, citizens are ethical, families are loving, and rituals carry meaning. Is it an ideal?
Yes.
But so was every great achievement in human history. Confucius showed us that idealism need not be naive. It can be practiced,
Lived. Taught.
passed down, from student to student, from parent to child, from past to future. And perhaps that is what makes him eternal. Not just that his words survived, but that they continue to grow inside us. So long as there are people who seek truth with humility, who strive to better themselves and serve others, who believe that virtue is stronger than violence, Confucius lives, not in statues, not in scrolls, but in the conscience of the world. In every age, in every heart, the eternal teacher. And so, as we close this journey, not just through the life of a man, but through the echo of his wisdom, we are reminded that greatness is not always loud. Sometimes, it walks with patience. It teaches in silence. It leaves no thrones behind, but countless hearts touched. Confucius may have died without a crown, but he gifted the world something far more enduring: the courage to be kind, the strength to be honest, and the hope that even in a broken world, virtue still matters. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you pause for a moment in this fast world, then let his legacy live a little longer. Like, share, and subscribe to join us in honoring the quiet voices that changed history. And tell us in the comments, which lesson from Confucius will you carry with you today? Until next time, stay curious, stay humble, and remember, the truest path forward always begins within.